From Vermont Public, this is The Frequency. I'm Mitch Wertlieb. It's Friday, March 7th, and here are today's headlines. Governor Phil Scott says he's pleased most school budgets were approved on town meeting day. Voters okayed roughly 90% of budgets earlier this week after many local school boards implemented cuts to help limit property tax increases. Property tax rates are expected to rise roughly 6%. That's compared to a spike of almost 16% last year. Still, Scott says lawmakers need to consider major changes to the state's educational governance and financing systems in the second half of the 2025 legislative session.
We can't declare victory. We have to stay focused. We also need the legislature to do their part and address education transformation this session, because we can't afford to wait.
Legislative leaders say education is a top priority, and they hope to work with the Scott administration on finding a solution. In other education news, Scott is appointing a former Bennington state senator to fill an impending vacant seat on the State Board of Education. 7 Days reports Democrat Brian Campion will replace Kim Gleason, whose 6-year term on the board is coming to an end. Campion served 14 years in the legislature before deciding not to run for re-election last fall. He was one of 3 Senate Democrats who voted to confirm Zoe Saunders as Education Secretary last year. Campion also chaired the Senate Education Committee, where he advocated for transferring rule-making authority from the State Board to the Agency of Education. Scott has proposed a similar move this year. The University of Vermont Tuesday instituted a 60-day hiring freeze in response to the Trump administration's proposed reductions in federal funding. The freeze applies to faculty, staff, and postdoc positions, including those currently posted. In a letter to deans and department chairs, university leaders said the pause is intended to safeguard their financial position. The university notes an anticipated reduction in their budget of at least 2% for next fiscal year. UVM is expected to provide an update next month. Despite killing other wild birds in Vermont, avian flu does not appear to be having a substantial impact on duck and geese populations here. That's according to the Vermont Department of Fish and Wildlife. David Sawsville with the department says the virus seems to be most harmful for colonial water birds like gulls. He says Fish and Wildlife has also recovered a few eagles over the last few years that died from bird flu.
When I go back to waterfowl, their trends over the decades, they seem to be holding their own at this point.
Sawsville says the state and federal government are monitoring migratory waterfowl populations for signs of bird flu impacts. The Vermont Truth and Reconciliation Commission has filled its third and final seat after it remained vacant for more than a year. Amanda Lucia Garces will join the panel, which is tasked with looking into discrimination perpetuated by the state and coming up with recommendations for repairing harm and preventing future discrimination. She previously served on the Vermont Human Rights Commission and has chaired the Fair and Impartial Policing Committee of the Vermont Criminal Justice Council. The commission notes the personal experience that Garces will bring to the role as an immigrant from Colombia and as the mother of a neurodiverse child. She begins with the commission on March 10th. Coming up, beavers and the dams they build may help Vermont become more resilient to flooding. Advocates have been making the case for supporting the large rodents, and we'll learn more after this. Beavers look cute with their big teeth, pudgy bodies, and little front paws. But don't let their looks deceive you. Beavers are hard workers and masterful engineers. They also draw the ire of their human neighbors when they plug culverts and flood roads or fields. Vermont Edition host Michaela Lafrac spoke with Skip Lyle, a wildlife biologist in Grafton, and naturalist Patty Smith of the Bonnie Vale Environmental Education Center in West Brattleboro about the semi-aquatic rodents.
Their brains are pretty small, relatively the size of a walnut, so a lot smaller than human brains. And so I just remind people of that because, solving the beaver-human conflict really boils down to the ability to outsmart beavers. And so I think the country and the species that put a man on the moon a long, long time ago can do that. There's no question. It's just a matter of will. And we have the ability, and and certainly in Vermont, we have the energetic and smart and skilled people to do it in a big way.
Well, we'll dive more into that human-beaver conflict in just a moment. But first, I want to get a better sense of the impact that they have on our landscapes. Let's start with the dams and lodges that they build. Patty, you said you've been observing beavers near your home and work in West Brattleboro for nearly 2 decades at this point. What are the structures like that they build?
I might back up just a little bit farther because I've
Sure.
also looked at historical photos, aerial photos of my town. And in the 1940s, when there were no beavers here, there were no open wetlands at all. And the beavers start reappearing here in the 1960s. And since then, each successive aerial photo session that's taken place shows more and more of these open marshlands and wetlands. And here in my backyard, just in the 17 years that I've been watching, what I've seen is not just new ponds appearing, but ponds that the beavers return to multiple times, assuming the character of semi-permanent wetlands because they build up organic soils and peat mosses. And these are the materials that really slow the flow of floodwaters and foster the persistence of wetland plants. It's quite a remarkable transformation, all thanks to beavers.
And Skip, how does a rodent with its little tiny paws, walking on 4 legs, build something like a dam? What are the physics of that?
I guess it begins with millions of years of evolutionary practice. So that's the starting point. But here's another thing about beavers is they're not very fast moving. And it's a good lesson, I guess, for our own species. But they are steady workers. They are just so steady. They get up and go to work every single day. Never take a vacation day, except for perhaps in the winter when they're bound to their lodges and slow down a lot. So a dam is a relatively flimsy structure. That's important in understanding what Patty alluded to, the history of flowages in Vermont and North America. It's made of mud and sticks, and it's in a constant state of decay. And so, the beavers will bring the sticks. They'll often chew them up into a transportable size and hold them in their mouth and place them in the dam. And then the mud component is just they'll frequently dive to the bottom of the pond, dig up a little pat of mud that they then, with their 2 front paws, hold against their chest, and then they swim over and they just drop it on the dam. So a typical, or certainly a long beaver dam, might represent hundreds of thousands of those evolutions, those beaver circles and those little pats of mud.
Sounds like there's a number of different countries from the UK to the Czech Republic that are trying to work with beavers in new ways. Patty, have you heard about any of these efforts in places outside Vermont?
In England, of course, beavers were long gone, and unfortunately, there was a release of a species that is native to Vermont, the mink, in England. And the mink was very good at hunting a species called the water vole that lived along streams in England. And streams, of course, in England without beavers were nice and straight. So at a site where beavers were reintroduced, the beavers immediately started creating complexity with dams and forked streams and canals. And the voles instantly had a lot more cover, a lot more places to hide. The mink couldn't just cruise up and down those straight streams. And the very rare water vole population has started to rebound there. So yay, beavers in England.
That was naturalist Patty Smith and wildlife biologist Skip Lyle speaking with Vermont Edition host Michaela Lafrac. You can listen to the full conversation about beavers on Vermont Edition's podcast feed. And we'll check in now with our weekly look at sports news. And for NHL teams looking to shore up their rosters for the playoffs or starting to rebuild for next year and beyond, it's a hockey version of Black Friday today, the busiest shopping day of the year. For the Black and Gold Boston Bruins, it's the first time in recent memory the team is playing the role of seller rather than buyer, following a moribund and deeply discouraging regular season campaign that technically could still end with a playoff berth but would take the equivalent of coming back from a 4-goal deficit in the third period to actually pull off. Last season's high-priced acquisitions of forward Elias Lindholm and defenseman Nikita Zadorov did nothing to fill the gaps left by the retirements of veterans Patrice Bergeron and David Krejci, and the Bruins are now faced with the daunting task of trying to restock a farm system depleted by trading away draft picks to acquire veterans that were expected to help Boston make a run at the Stanley Cup the past couple of seasons. Instead, those squads flamed out in disappointing first and second round playoff series to the defending Stanley Cup champion Florida Panthers, and the proverbial cupboard of young talent in Boston is nearly empty. Suffice it to say that unless the front office headed by General Manager Don Sweeney and President Cam Neely can pull off some trade magic by the end of the day, those two could be looking at the possibility of being replaced by team ownership, with Sweeney's job being most at risk since he took over in 2015 and has not launched any duck boat parade celebrations in Beantown since. Neely took over as president in 2010, and the following year was able to hoist the hardware that eluded him as a player during his Hall of Fame on-ice career with the Bees. But to be fair to former Bruins defenseman Sweeney, he's already made one move on the trade front, and it was a pretty good one, sending forward Trent Frederick to the Edmonton Oilers for a rookie defenseman plus second and fourth round draft picks. That's a pretty good haul for a team that didn't otherwise have a second-round pick in this year's upcoming draft, and the selection will be in the middle of that round instead of the bottom end because it belongs to the St. Louis Blues from an earlier swap they made with Edmonton. Frederick had a very good campaign for the Bruins 2 seasons ago, scoring a career-high 18 goals, but this was a down year for the big bruising forward, who tallied just 8 goals and 7 assists for Boston before being dealt to the Oilers. He was also set to become an unrestricted free agent next season, so getting a prospect and 2 draft picks for a player who may have skated away for nothing is a kind of win for the Bruins in their efforts to retool. Other players who could be on the move by the end of the day include forwards Justin Brazeau and Charlie Coyle, and the player every Bruins fan will be watching most closely, team captain Brad Marchand, who's spent his entire 16-year career with Boston and is the only active player left from the team's last Stanley Cup winning squad in 2011. There are plenty of teams contending for the Cup this year that would love to add Marchand to the mix, and some may dangle tantalizing prospects and or first-round draft picks as bait. But my personal hope here is that Marchand, who is set to become a free agent next season, signs one more contract with the Bruins to finish out his career in Boston. Players that spend their entire careers with one team, especially those like Marchand who came up through the Bruins farm system, don't come along very often. And unless a club makes Sweeney an offer so good he just can't refuse, it doesn't make sense to further agitate an already disgruntled fan base by trading away the team's longest tenured and most decorated player. Over the border, the Montreal Canadiens are in a bit of a pickle when it comes to deciding whether to buy or sell at the deadline. Sporting nearly the same record as Boston, they can also possibly sneak into the postseason, but it's highly unlikely given the number of teams that have to leapfrog to get there. The rebuild has been underway in the mecca of hockey for a few years now, so it's more likely the Habs will stand pat or make some minor moves, but nothing that would risk depleting their draft pool or that would ship out coveted young players like forward Cole Caulfield. In the NBA this week, Peyton Pritchard and Derek White put on quite the show for the Boston Celtics in their 128-118 win over the Portland Trail Blazers Wednesday night, becoming the first tandem in Celtics history to each score 40 points in the same game. Pritchard notched career highs in both points, 43 of them total, and in three-point shooting, scoring from beyond the arc 10 times, just one shy of the all-time team record for trays in a game that was set by former Celtic fan favorite Marcus Smart. White scored 41 points and finished with 9 triples as the Celtics continue to cruise toward the postseason, looking very much like a team that intends to repeat as league champions. Thanks for listening to The Frequency today. We had additional reporting from Bob Kinzel, Adia Golston, Lexi Krupp, Abigail Giles, and Elodie Reed. Our executive producer is Kevin Trevelyan, and our music is by Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Mitch Wertlieb. Talk to you tomorrow.
Each morning, it's a new opportunity, a chance to start fresh. Up First from NPR makes each morning an opportunity to learn and to understand. Choose to join the world every morning with Up First, a podcast that hands you everything going on across the globe and down the street, all in 15 minutes or less. Start your day informed and anew with Up First by subscribing wherever you get your podcasts.